call to order the regular meeting of the Village of Riverside, Illinois Planning and Zoning Commission for Wednesday, April 25th, 2018. Director Abt, call the roll, please.
Chairperson Mateo?
I am here.
Commissioner Hannon?
I'm here.
Commissioner Mahol?
I'm here.
Commissioner Miller?
Here.
Commissioner Pelletier?
Here.
Absent are Commissioner Scanlon and Commissioner Mendoza.
Do we have a motion to approve the minutes of the regular meeting of March 28th, 2018? So moved.
Second.
All right. Any discussion? It was lengthy. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any abstentions?
Me, I abstain.
Okay. All right. Do we have any visitors, petitions, citizen requests, or communications? This is your chance to speak up if you want, or one of your chances. All right. Welcome. Director Abt, do you have a village board report?
I do not.
I don't think so.
I don't think there's really been any planning and zoning related items. We are anticipating having the beginnings of our facilities assessment on the March, would that be 3rd agenda? March 3rd, sorry, May 3rd. Wow, okay. On our May 3rd agenda, so if you're interested in attending that or watching, just to kind of get an idea of what the process is and kind of these beginning steps. I think the first one is going to be kind of going over the process and then their existing conditions analysis. So I would imagine at some point the Planning and Zoning Commission would get involved when we get to, if and when we get to actual plans, if there's any additions or any things like that are recommended coming out of the study. But, you know, at this point, we're just at kind of the existing facilities analysis. So, but that's coming, getting started. So just to keep that on your radar screen. That's about it.
Thank you.
The village hired Williams Architects. Mm-hmm.
Moving on, next up is old business. Continued discussion and recommendations to staff on a draft text amendment related to attached garages and driveways.
Yes, so back in February, you directed staff to prepare a draft text amendment that incorporated your recommendations on attached front-loaded garages and driveways, including requiring that the attached front-loaded garages be set back 5 feet from the main facade, that driveway widths be limited to 10 feet, and that attached garages may widen up to meet the front of the garage, but only for the 15 feet rather than the 20 feet that we allow for the detached garages. Also reducing the building separation from 10 feet to 3 feet in order to follow the building code, and also to provide a building coverage bonus for new residential buildings that choose to build a detached garage. So the text amendment that's before you, the draft, incorporates those changes. There was a little bit of discussion at the March meeting, but it was primarily continued to this meeting so that more of the commissioners could be in attendance and provide more discussion on it. Some of the feedback that we did receive at the meeting or via email, I've incorporated into this latest amendment, and that included adding a definition for a driveway approach or apron, and adding side-loaded garages to the residential driveway regulations, because there wasn't anything about allowing that apron for the side-loaded garages, that wider apron to meet all of the garage bays. Some other comments that were submitted including limiting the width of driveways to the width of the garage doors rather than the width of the garage itself, specifying how garage width is measured. Should it be measured from the garage doors or the garage walls? And also reducing the maximum flare size to minimize the width of the driveway aprons at the curb. Staff believes that the commission should kind of discuss these and vet these items out a little bit further and come to a consensus before they're incorporated into the draft text amendment. So those are not included in the amendment that's before you right now. The village engineer did provide me with the Institute for Transportation Engineers manual about residential driveways, and they recommend a larger flare than what the village requires. So they actually require a 5-foot flare on each side for residential driveways. So that would give you if you have a 10-foot driveway, that would give you a 20-foot wide curb cut, basically. And the village engineer noted that problems can arise from having driveway aprons that are too narrow, including having to enter the driveway at almost a 90-degree angle, or having people run over the parkway, or issues with maneuvering, especially if there's a car parked across the street from the driveway. So he does not recommend reducing the flare to below 3 feet, so he's not necessarily advising to go any lower than what our current standard is with the 3 feet. And as I noted before, most of the communities in the area do have that 3-foot flare requirement in their code. So you have the text amendment before you. We can kind of work through it. I did add that driveway apron definition. So it says that portion of every driveway which extends from the street across any public parkway and sidewalk space to the owner's property line, to kind of define that out a little bit better. So that removes the driveway definitions that were in there, and now we're just these encroachments are regulating that public parkway portion rather than the private driveway. So the private driveway regulations are in the zoning code versus in the municipal public ways section. So if you guys have any comments on any of the wording that I chose or anything like that, we can work through that. I guess the building coverage bonus, the way I wrote it was, I added it under the bulk requirements for the residential districts. So we added it as I, and it says, in determining the building coverage for new residential buildings, those having a detached garage and no other garage shall exclude the area of the detached garage, but no more than 400 square feet in determining the amount of building coverage for the zoning lot. So it allows for that up to 400 square feet additional building coverage, but we're still keeping the impervious surface restrictions to that 45 or 50%, depending on what zoning district that you're in. So we're still, reining in how much impervious surface coverage you have on there, but giving that little bit of flexibility for the actual building.
So Chapter 8 and Chapter 10 are no longer at odds, so we're set there.
Right, so this will, the one will cross-reference to 8, to Title 8, which is the public ways section about the encroachment widths, and that's specifically just for the driveway aprons, and that section will no longer reference private driveways, but will just reference the aprons.
I like using apron rather than approach. Would anybody prefer approach? Okay. And the fire rating is in building code, right?
Yes, the fire rating is in the building code.
One sort of question I had in 10-7-3, subsection 4, as changed.
Page number, please.
3.
Faster.
3.
Thanks.
Okay.
It talks about porches protruding at least 5 feet in front of the front building wall. It made, the changes, I think, are consistent. I'm just wondering if we should talk about porches here, since we've already said the garage is already set back 5 feet from the main part of the building, if this is just, if this is needed anymore.
I had the same question.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can take that. I mean, I think the idea was for that separation, and again, now with putting it the 5 feet back, maybe that doesn't even need to be there anymore.
I think it's covered in 3, and just would hate to have yet another straight porch reference.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I fully support Ed's commentary.
Okay, so we can strike that out. And then does anybody have any preference on how the garage width is measured? Yeah, it's restricted to 50% of, not to exceed 50% of the width of the building, and the way I wrote it was from the walls, I think is how we wrote it. Let me double check here now, I'm doubting myself.
On page 5, you have it from walls. Under the attached garages.
Yeah, so measuring it from walls, we could do it just measuring the, from the edge of the door to the edge of the other door. That's the other option to do it. There's been, since it doesn't specifically say in the code how it's done now, or how it should be measured now, it kind of depends on what type of garage they go with. So some will try to, widen their porch so it overhangs that wall. Some, that is the wall of the garage. So in those cases, do you measure to the wall because it's covered with a little bit of porch area, or do you measure to the garage doors? Typically in those cases, our plan reviewer has measured from the edge of garage door to edge of garage door, but if it's one that protrudes out, then they measure from wall to wall. So, having it be specific in the code and then just being consistent going forward, if there's a preference for how we do that. If we're not going to allow it to project forward anymore and it has to be set back, how do we feel about measuring that?
I like the objectiveness from the garage wall. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to figure out what is a garage wall, as opposed to somewhat ambiguity of where do you start.
Commissioner Miller, do I remember you had an opinion on this?
I did have an opinion on it, and I actually sort of discovered that in practice, at least in one case, the plan reviewer used the edges of the garage doors in the house that's going up right now instead of the entire garage. So it caused me some concern because it was more than 50% of the facade. I'm in favor of having it less than 50% of the facade and then somehow defining the facade. So I know that it seems like the plan reviewer has not been using wall to wall. He's been using edge to edge, except in those instances where you have obviously a garage that has been protruding. You can't really do that because the whole garage is protruding. So I think there should be consistency, and it should be wall to wall. That would be my opinion. But I also favor reducing the percentage of the facade.
Commissioner Martin?
Thinking. I assume we're speaking to exterior walls. That's where correct? When you
So the exterior end wall to, if you look at the floor plan, where is that wall coming in to the, usually you have to kind of look at the floor plan to see where that garage wall comes into the front elevation.
That's the only place I get hung up, is when you look at the interior, depending on how the architect or designer plays around with that space. You can create a lot of interior space, if you follow what I'm saying. I don't know how much of an issue that's been. I think it's easy, and I'm being deliberately vague because I don't have a good answer. I think walls is good, but I don't know what happens when we push the garage 5 feet behind the facade. You no longer have one side particularly well defined.
So, Commissioner Martel, you're thinking that on the interior of the garage, that they might just use it for something other than garage?
Correct.
It might be used for something else.
For storage.
Right, sure.
So the interior of the garage, from the outside, it may look like it's only 20 feet, but on the inside of the garage, it's actually 25 or 30
Yes,
feet.
and that's where I'm going with this. That's why if we said, maybe we just say exterior walls.
What's the concern if from the exterior it's only 50%, but interior there's more storage? I mean, we're looking for streetscape and
Which
So
is fine.
if
I'm
it's set
only-
back, you have the edge where it's going to be
right.
set back, so you're just measuring from that edge to the outside edge, where it is the end of the house. So that's a fairly definitive place to be measuring from. And is that at 50% or less? of
I'm
the
really
overall
only,
width?
and I'll be honest, I'm really only looking at it from the perspective of how wide is the driveway that you get to the front of your garage. So are they going to use that interior space to kind of stretch the width of the driveway?
But we still have the cap at 50%.
And most of the facade, yeah.
So I just don't see how they end up getting, how they game the system with that. I mean, I think we attempted to address that with the tapering, as opposed to just having a slab all the way down the entire width of the garage. Now we're saying you have to taper, and in my mind, that addressed the abundance of concrete issue that sort of led us down this path.
And I think you're right, the 50% rule does define the maximum width of that garage. However they're trying to measure it, that's a very fixed number. Then sticking with walls is,
Wall to wall.
yes.
And then for the driveway, I guess then the question is, do we want the driveway to be able to extend the whole width of that wall-to-wall garage, or do we want it to be restricted to the openings, the edge of the openings for the garage doors?
I think we have, if I'll jump into this, I think we need to allow at least a little bit beyond the garage door edges, because I have yet to see a driveway that's exactly purely the width of the doors. There's a little bit of extra. And we could say garage doors plus 1 foot.
I would be tempted to do less than 1 foot, if you mean on either side. And I actually have seen a lot of driveways walking around the village where they do come up right up to the edge of the doors, but most of them go to the edge of the garage wall. They go to the wall. So
Right.
there's like usually maybe another 4 or 5 inches, it looks like.
Yeah, I would agree. I've been
Yeah.
looking at that as well.
Depends on how they pour it. I don't know how people make that decision. If it's the concrete
I think usually it's
Or-
poured to the width of the walls,
width of the walls.
at
Okay.
least for exterior or independent garages, detached garages.
Definitely for detached garages.
No, the tapering requirement has not been changed. I mean, it's the same wording that's always been in the code. Is that right? Okay.
So maybe we could make it for front-loaded attached garages. It should, the apron or the driveway should
The
be
driveway.
6 inches outside, can be poured 6 inches outside the opening, the garage
To
door
either side.
opening on either
That'd be
side.
fair.
What are other, in the sample, is there any trend on garage door, garage wall?
I think there was a couple that did restrict it to the width of the garage door.
Okay, so it wouldn't be an outlier?
Right. There were a couple that did that, yeah.
I like this 6-inch leeway. I think a foot is too much, and the whole point is to reduce the concrete up front. I like that idea.
So you're suggesting 6 inches outside the doors rather than to the walls?
Yes.
For attached front-loaded garages, yes.
So 6 inches outside, not to exceed the wall.
Deferring to,
Whichever is less.
Yeah, whichever is less.
Yes?
Yes.
yes.
I think Michael will be helping me finesse that one a bit. And then what was the other? Is everybody okay with keeping it a 3-foot flare then, given the
Yes.
engineer's recommendation
Yes.
for the driveway aprons?
An informal survey along Riverside Road would indicate that the vast majority are about 3 feet.
Okay.
And I have a concern on the attached front-loaded garages. We don't have a minimum setback on them anywhere. And
How do you mean?
Well, the front yard is an effective setback, but I know I can think of at least one instance where this 15-foot, I think, might actually hit the property line, maybe even the sidewalk line.
Yeah, I mean, there's,
So, so that would mean that if they have a 15-foot driveway that's the width of, say, a two-car garage, then it's going to be hitting the sidewalk at that full 15 feet, which is what we're trying to avoid.
but in that case, is it really feasible?
It's not feasible to have a front-loaded garage, I guess, would be my
Preference.
pardon.
Your preference at that point?
Yeah, exactly. That it shouldn't be an option. Is that unreasonable?
I think that's up for discussion. I mean, we kind of drew a line in the sand saying if your house was, had a 20-foot setback, you're not going to be able to have a porch then, or you'll have to come in and ask for a variance.
Or you're not going to have a front-loaded garage.
And in this, maybe in this case, you're not going to have a front-loaded garage
Right.
then.
Or a two-car,
Or, right, a two-car front-loaded, you could do one.
or tandem, yeah.
Yeah.
Not quite sure how we write that in.
Well, and we talked about this last meeting, at least in my mind we did, that the uniqueness of the lots in Riverside, some, if we are going to allow front-loading garages, some will have that 15 feet coming straight out to the sidewalk, but that is a different animal than a front-end loaded garage that's 25 feet back that has the line of concrete coming all the way out to the street, which is where we got to the taper discussion. What I'm concerned about is if we come to the conclusion that if you don't have at least X feet of driveway, you don't get a front-end loaded garage. The uniqueness of the lots may make some of these lots, simply unbuildable, and I think we came to the conclusion that there's a lot of housing stock where it's a coin toss between do you rehab or is it time to tear it down? And I'd hate to hamstring the ability to tear it down and build a new house when the time comes to save 5 feet of concrete. I mean, I think at least in my mind, the concern is a full run of concrete for an extended period of time. But if it's less than 15 feet, that's in my mind, 15 feet of concrete is not a lot.
I guess I thought that our intent was to minimize the kind of the concrete at the property.
In the street, yeah.
Which is really So,
Well, I think reducing the facade percentage would also kind of, because a lot of these lots that are more tricky to build on are narrower lots, and sometimes they're not very deep. And so they're already maxing out if they're doing a two-car front-loaded garage at 50%. I mean, they can just barely squeeze it in. So if we were to reduce that, we would kind of be forcing people to have one-car front-loaded garages or something else. So because I do kind of agree with you on that. I mean, I think we have to be practical, but we have to try and also deal with the practical problems that we see as a village, as well as the property owners' concerns or the developers' concern.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to your idea. I just wanted to raise that concern and hopefully solicit more discussion, because I agree our overall objective is to avoid that concrete streetscape.
right.
But, I think we have unique lots that make it a more complex discussion than would otherwise be in other village layouts.
I would advocate, if not making a minimum setback for the garage, perhaps stating on this, on page 5, item 4B, where we're talking about the 15 feet, you know, that they can have 15 feet from the garage, that we clearly state that, but it still needs to be 10 feet at the property line. Which would kind of effectively
Okay.
require them to, yeah, to have the distance.
And if you do have another 5-foot pushback, that
Yeah.
gives you more than
Right.
exists right now, so you have,
Yeah. And the only reason I would, you know, maybe advocate a minimum setback is, will they just put it in and then drive over the parkway? You know what I mean? If you don't, they'll still put the two-car garage in, make it taper quickly to be 10 feet at the property line, and then just not have enough maneuvering room. But,
And there's instances of that in the village where lawns and
Yeah.
gravel
Yeah.
has been put in.
yeah.
Director Abt, with the proposed restriction, can you think of recent projects where that would have made a two-car front-loading garage an impossibility? And perhaps on such lots, they would not have been able to do a detached garage in the rear?
The only one I can think of is possibly the one on Blooming Bank, right across from the swim club. That had a pretty small, I want to say it was maybe a 15-foot, actually, 15-foot front setback.
Oh, yeah.
So their garage is, you know, right there at about 15 feet setback from the property line. So even in that instance, you know, they would have had to drop it down pretty rapidly to 10 feet. And that was one where it was really questionable whether or not they were going to be able to get a detached garage in there and meet their impervious and building coverage. Just because it's a substandard lot for that zoning district, it was, I don't even know that it was 7,000 square feet, to be honest. It's a very small lot, so.
And so that would be an instance where, I mean,
A variance maybe.
they would come in for a variance. If it's a substandard lot, it's, you know, there's pretty,
I mean, it took a little finagling, but they were able to
Yeah.
figure out something to make it meet the code and obviously be able to build without coming before you. Further restriction might have, had they pushed the garage back some, which they didn't really on that one, it's pretty straight in line with the rest of the house, that might have afforded them some ability to be able to taper it a little bit more, because then maybe it would have been 20 feet setback. So maybe they would have been able to taper it a little bit.
And that was going to be my observation. If right now, the example we're speaking of, that front facade is at 15, by these new rules, they'd have to be 20 feet back. So you would get what you're looking for.
Right. Yeah, but you do have those odd instances in town where you have houses that are maybe only 8 feet off of their property line. I think about the one over on Fairbank by the bridge that got built. It was an addition, and they ended up putting the
Oh, yeah.
garage as kind of like a side-loaded in the back. But just thinking about that lot, it was fairly narrow, and additionally, its setback is about 8 feet.
yeah.
So it's a very small front yard there. So in that instance, you know, doing a front-load garage just might not be feasible. Unless they chose to really, you know, push the house back on the lot to be able to accommodate it. That does change the character over there a little bit. We do have a little bit of weirdness there next door to it with the two houses on the one lot, so, you know.
So to put you on the spot, you don't think that proposed provision would be too onerous overall?
I don't think so. I mean, again, I mean, obviously, we have our unique
Yes.
lots here and there, but all in all,
We could work with it,
I think it's,
with the variation process.
in those, in those cases, they can go through not that they want to go through the variation process, and, again, it's a slightly higher bar if you're doing new construction. They're really going to have to show that there's no other way that they can really make something work on the lot.
But at least they'll kind of be forced to be more creative instead of just,
If they want to just
Put it in.
get it through,
right.
they'll figure out how to make it work. We might not get the prettiest thing, the prettiest driveway in the world, but, they'll figure out how to make it work. But, I'm just thinking most of them typically that we've had 30-foot, 40-foot front yards. So, that provides room to be able to taper that driveway down.
The other commissioners in agreement with this? Proposed restriction?
Yeah, I am, yes.
Okay, so 6 inches on each side, and then definitely has to get to 10 feet by the property line.
At the property.
Yes.
In no circumstances is it allowed to be wider than 10 feet at the front property line for the driveway.
Right. But no one else is in favor of having some kind of a tapering requirement. I mean, I could just see where someone has a driveway and they maintain it for, 15 feet wide or 14 feet wide for all the way down, and then they taper it down to 10 feet at the very end of their driveway. But no one else has a concern about that we not have a tapering, rate?
So, I asked the engineer to take a look at it. He's been a little hung up on some other projects, so he's not been able to kind of provide me with an opinion on whether there is a reasonable taper rate to imply. But like I said, just looking at other villages and stuff, nobody has a taper rate. Some of them have like slope requirements for like aprons and things like that, but I didn't see anything for a specific rate you have to bring your driveway down to. It was, the property line, it can't exceed this, and your maximum width is the width of your garage, and it's somehow you got to figure out how to get down to that.
And we do have an impervious surface.
That's true, right. I thought about that. We still have that requirement, so. There was one thing I wasn't clear about. When you added the change to the side-loaded garage and have them pushed back, they must be pushed back at least 5 feet from the front of the building, just like the front-loaded garage. I'm a little confused. Does it make sense to continue talking about front building wall then? Because if everything is pushed back, I just don't know. I know there's no definition of front building wall. I know it's used in various spots in the code, but is that going to be clear to people what front building wall means? And I think it might be used in the facade discussion too, perhaps front building wall.
Anybody else have an issue with that term?
I think it's self-obvious.
Well, and if you go, I'm kind of with Commissioner Hammond here, and also if you look at page 3, number 3, we say front building wall, and then also which excludes any architectural elements such as bay windows or unenclosed porches. So it does define it. It gets away, it eliminates any extraneous architectural elements that someone could try and use to game the system, I think.
That was kind of the intention. That had been something that Commissioner Mendoza had brought up, I think, in either January or February, is how do you determine where you measure that from? Do you use the bay windows? Do you use the porch? What do you use for that? So this kind of makes it clear. And Oak Park similarly used, I think, that kind of language in it. So.
Was there a discussion as to why why we're requiring the side-loaded garages also to be pushed back for 5 feet from the building facade?
Well, it had a similar, I just changed it to match, because before it matched, front-loaded couldn't protrude more than 5 feet, side-loaded couldn't protrude more than 5 feet. So we can still keep it to side-loaded, can't project more than 5 feet from the main wall if we want to keep it that way. If we changed one and they were the same, I figured we would change both, but we don't have to.
No, I think it's appropriate to change both.
I'm just thinking of a side-loaded garage. The idea is sort of like the side of that faces the street is supposed to look just like the house. So if that's then pushed back 5 feet, it might make the house look, it might have, I don't know, just architectural implications for how you design that house. I don't know. That's my thought.
Yeah, I kind of feel like it doesn't, I don't
It's
know.
not as
the need
necessary.
is- Exactly. So maybe it could say that it should not protrude in front of the house.
So keep it at the 5 feet, the way it was before, that it can't project more than 5 feet.
No, it shouldn't project at all, I guess.
Right, not project
It has to
in
be
front of the
even
building
with
wall.
the front face of the building.
Okay.
I guess before we move on from that, what's the objection to having, keep it as it is for the side load where they can come out 5 feet?
Well, what did it say? It said before that it shall not protrude. And now we're saying it should be pushed back by 5 feet, just like a front-loading garage. And my point just was, if you look at the side-loading garage, though, the side that faces the street is supposed to look just like the house. So if you have that being pushed back, then you have like this 5-foot bump back for a house. And maybe it even draws attention to the fact that that's a garage. I don't know if you're looking at the facade of the house like that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we should require it to be set back.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to go
Other
back to the way it was and just say that it can't, not that it has to project, but that it cannot protrude more than the 5 feet?
I think at least go back that way. And again, I've looked at some other houses around, and I have to say, I mean, there are some side-loading garages that sort of have a courtyard in front of them. It actually looks very good, but I know that it must have been built before this was changed. So I don't necessarily want to say that we should change the way the code has been for years. A lot of it just depends upon the kind of size of the property you have and the quality of your architect, I think.
So I think the idea of going with the maximum projection of 5 feet was to keep people from doing those, kind of snot-nosed garages
yeah.
where you come around the front and then you have all the driveway kind of in the front yard.
Right,
So I think it
right.
was to prevent that from happening.
Right.
So it has to be one that can only be entered by the one side.
Right.
And
You know,
again,
that's-
that does, that might be an option that works for our larger lots in our R1AA district, but it's certainly not something that's going to work in the 50-foot wide lots in our R1A district. So that
And
one
they
kind of
still
goes out
can't-
the window right away.
They still can't protrude into the front yard.
Right, I mean, the setback is still
Right,
the
it's still a
setback. We're just
setback.
saying that it
Okay,
can't
yeah.
project from that
Right.
building wall more than the 5 feet.
But allowing them to project allows them to have the angled one, potentially. Thinking of the one on Nuttall. Anyway, I'm in favor of leaving it the way it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, and I think we've discussed at a prior meeting how we don't want to limit the number of garage spaces people have necessarily. Is that right? So if you put it in your house, we're not going to say a 3-car garage or even a 4-car garage is not allowed as long as you're otherwise meeting the code.
Case in point, the addition on Riverside Road. So I want to say that might be a 4-car side-loaded garage, but it's at the back of the house. So it doesn't face back, it's at the back of the house, but it's still side-loaded, it's set back a little bit on the edge of the house. So
On Riverside Road?
it's on Riverside Road. There's a very large addition going on the house over there, and it's a attached garage. It's like a mudroom and then attached garage, and then they're putting, I think, a master suite or something above of the garage. So it's a very large addition over there, and I believe it is actually about a four-car garage, so.
Well, the larger garages are useful for storage.
There's that.
I know a lot of people only use the garages for storage.
I was one of those people.
So on page 4, figure 6B, we're going to take out or porch from the figure legend, right? I have a general question about these figures. And they predated you, so I can say this. Is there any way we can have high-quality ones?
That is my goal, is to create some new figures to put in there. So I will do my best, sketch it that I can do and make it a little bit more legible.
Be great, thanks. Page 5, the first B. Do we want to specify for the detached garage that we're also measuring width based on garage walls?
So a portion of the driveway approaching the garage is permitted to widen to the width of the garage as measured to the walls?
Sure.
And I'm wondering, just for clarity, if we should say the exterior edge of the garage walls. I don't know.
For all places?
Yes,
Yep.
right, just for clarity, so that people aren't confused, where am I measuring to when they're submitting the plans?
Okay.
And so the width of the driveway at the garage can extend 20 feet back for all of them except for the attached front loading, which is 15, right?
Right.
Okay. That's all I have.
One question I had on, now that we have the 3-foot length for detached garage, I mean, do we have to be worried about front-end loading detached garages that are, sort of even with the facade, so you have a wide lot?
Well, that's still considered the side yard, so it still has to be beyond that back plane of the house. Still has to be in the rear yard. It just
Okay,
can only be as close as 3 feet to the,
got it.
To the
Okay,
corner.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
so I think the only time we allow a garage in the side yard is if somebody has a substandard rear yard. If it's not feasible to build a detached garage in the backyard, then the code allows for them to be built in the side yard. So maybe that's something that should be addressed in those instances where those garages maybe should only have have the same design standards for the one door for each parking spot, just to kind of keep that. Maybe the driveway restrictions are the same then.
We're talking about side loading?
No, a detached garage is technically only permitted in the rear yard, but the code does make an allowance for you to have a detached garage in your side yard if you don't have a backyard that you can actually put a garage into. So if you have sort of a substandard rear yard, you're allowed to have a detached garage in the side yard. That's how the code reads. So in those instances, which are obviously going to be fairly rare, it makes the allowance to have that garage in the side yard, but we don't have any design.
And that's
That's not really addressed in any of our design standards, so.
You can do that without a variance?
Mm-hmm.
Put a garage in the side yard.
So if that were to be added, it would be under
Driveways for detached garages. So 3, so E3.
Make a new C, maybe? Are we in favor of recommending that side yard detached garages have single doors? Like the front loading attached garages are required to have?
I would think so.
Yeah. Yes.
Codify that?
Front-loaded attached garages are not necessarily required to have one door.
A single door for each bay?
you're not allowed-
sorry. a
yeah.
single
For each
door.
car, sorry.
Yeah, you're not allowed to have a two-car wide
Got it.
door. You have to have individual doors
Right.
for each bay.
Yes,
So that would apply
Better
to
said.
both.
yes.
Are you proposing that applies to both detached and attached?
Only to detached in the side yard, not
Okay.
detached in the rear yard,
Okay.
is what I, yeah, okay. So let's see. Residential detached garage design requirements. So we can add that under that, so that can be a new number 3. So. So we'll do the same, garage doors cannot exceed 9 feet in width.
Right.
And then under the driveways, how do we work that? Yeah, maybe a new C, and then C becomes D, and we can say residential driveways that provide access to a detached garage in the side yard. And then do we want to do the same where it can only come out 15 feet?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
And that has to taper down to the 10?
And,
Yeah?
yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So it looks like the main changes are the side yard detached garage that we just discussed, and then the setback provision. So do we want to see those electronically? No, we can't do that, that would violate open meetings. No, we can, right? And
I can get a
give our
consensus from you
comments,
guys.
and then it can go to preservation, and then we would do the public hearing for the text amendment, right?
Right, so I'm actually going to be giving the village board an update at the next meeting on our discussion, just to make sure we have their buy-in in the direction that we're going. And then the Preservation Commission meets in June. So we'll have it on their June agenda, and then we can probably publish for the June Planning and Zoning Commission meeting to have the public hearing on it, because we'll have the Preservation Commission's input on that and be able to provide that for you for that meeting, if they have any changes or any concerns.
Any other final thoughts on driveways and garages? Okay, thanks. Moving on to continued discussion and direction to staff on possible changes to zoning code relative to stoops, porches, awnings, and impervious surfaces.
Well, could I just ask one question for clarification? I suppose this is mostly for Sonia, but let's say you have someone with a driveway and then you've got like a little extra concrete area, and of course I'm thinking about a particular house next to it that they use as like a basketball hoop platform or something like that. Is that just lumped in with impervious surface, or is that somehow considered part of the driveway? I mean, if people have these sort of accessory concrete areas for other non-driveway uses.
I know we have restrictions for, like, the walkways have, if you have a
Be 3
walkway in your
feet,
front yard, it
right.
has to be separated from that. I think we've made some allowances for a small pad for
Okay.
the basketball hoops, and we haven't counted that as part of the driveway width, but it does get counted towards impervious surface.
Okay.
So. Okay. So. .173 gauge kind of opened up this Pandora's box of stoops, porches, awnings, roofs discussion. What is what's appropriate, how big should they be allowed to be, etc. So what I did was take our porch survey that we had done from when we were looking at porches and kind of looked at those communities, and also looked to see what they had for regulations for stoops and for awnings, you know, roof encroachments, decks, that kind of stuff. So in looking at those communities, what I saw was for awnings and canopies, most communities' definitions are very similar to Riverside's. Some consider awnings to be temporary in nature, while canopies are considered more permanent. Our definition does not really make that distinction. Most communities allow awnings and canopies to encroach into the required front yard to some degree. Some limit it to 1.5 feet, and some have no limit at all. World's your oyster. Oak Park and Hinsdale, interestingly enough, both restricted the width. In Oak Park, canopies are restricted to 15 feet or no more than 3 feet extension on either side of a doorway. And in Hinsdale, awnings and canopies are restricted to 1/3 of the building width. So just kind of some things that people do with awnings. And then for porches, like I said previously, most communities don't actually define porch, and those that do consider porches to be roofed structures. One says roof or roof-like structure. For stoops, there was actually only 2 communities that define stoop. Some communities have no stoop regulations whatsoever. However, they do allow unroofed stairs or steps to encroach, so kind of similar to what we have. Some restrict the height of their stoops to 4 feet above grade, and some had no restrictions on the amount of encroachment, and others had restrictions that ranged from 6 feet to 11 feet into a required front yard. So that's kind of how far out from the face of the building, basically, that it could come out. Clarendon Hills allows permanent, non-enclosed entryway covers to project 6 feet into the required front yard, provided they are no more than 12 feet in width. So that was kind of an interesting one. And some communities have stoop design guidelines. Those are typically more geared towards multifamily and townhomes developments, but that's kind of where you kind of get some stoop regulations that you can see. One has a maximum width and depth requirements, and some others had minimum width and depth requirements. So similar to a porch, you know, porches have to be a minimum of 5 feet. You know, I talked about how newer communities are kind of requiring a porch to be a livable space. You're not just getting a little fake 1 foot little railing that's in front of it. You know, it has to be an actual livable space. I think that's kind of where you get those minimum width and depth requirements, that there's a certain massing they're looking for in that development. And then we get into decks. So decks are typically defined as being a structure without a roof or having no permanent or temporary cover or canopy. There was only 3 communities that allowed decks to encroach into a front yard. Most only allow them to encroach into the rear yard. The maximum encroachment into the front yard for those that did allow them was 5 feet, and one did not limit the encroachment. However, decks are restricted to only being 8 inches tall. So, as far as building code requirements, the building code requires that there be a landing or floor on each side of an exterior door, and that landing must be no more than 1.5 inches lower than the top of that threshold into the building. So, and that landing must be at least as wide as the door and have a minimum depth of 3 feet. So the building code requires stairs to have a maximum rise of 7.75 inches and a minimum tread of 10 inches. So you kind of get, you know, each step is going to be 10 inches, you know, and then you have the 7.75 inches as you're coming down as you're trying to meet the grade. So that's, I think, kind of the reason that since you have these building code restrictions on stairs, that's why they typically allow them, some communities will allow them to encroach as needed to meet the building code, whereas others put restrictions on that. And I think in those instances, they're trying to make sure that you're not going to be creating a stoop or a door that's too high, you know? So I think that kind of comes in where you get those requirements that stoops can't be taller than 4 feet, because they don't want those stairs to be never-ending. Let's see. We also talked about impervious surface, because part of that discussion with Gage was that because they were taking away a certain amount of impervious surface and we were going to have a net loss, is that something that we want to allow for properties that are non-conforming in impervious surface, that if we at least get some sort of net reduction, that we're okay with them building somewhere else on the lot. So I added a section under our proposed adding a section into our non-conforming chapter for dealing with non-conforming impervious surfaces. We have a section in there for like non-conforming sidewalls and for driveways and dumpster enclosures and things like that. So here we have non-conforming impervious surfaces. We have where an existing lot is legally non-conforming as to its impervious surface coverage for the zoning district in which it is located. New impervious surface coverage is allowed on the lot without the need for a variation, only if the total impervious surface as calculated with the new coverage will be decreased on the lot overall by at least 10%. I came up with that 10% number by looking at our land disturbing activities chapter in our building code, and that's where we go by, that's where our triggers happen for requiring a grading plan for doing any sort of work on a property. So in there, if you're going to be doing, if you're doing land disturbing activities, i.e. like a patio and things like that, that are going to increase your impervious surface by 10%, or by more than 10%, I think is how it reads, you are required to provide a grading plan. We have automatic triggers for any building addition that's 400 square feet or more. Obviously, any new house has to provide a grading plan. And then same trigger of that 400 square feet is for detached garages. So if you're going to do a detached garage of 400 square feet or more, you're required to provide a grading plan. So I used that 10% number since it was something that was kind of already in our code. I thought that was a good starting place, at least, to look at. I know for the last meeting, when we ended up continuing the discussion, Commissioner Mendoza, I believe, had emailed saying that he thought the number should be bigger than 10%. So I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but I think he had expressed some concern that 10% was too small. He would like to see a larger decrease in the overall impervious surface in order to allow somebody to be able to do something. So the other part of that is Part B, says this does not apply to existing circular driveways in residential districts that do not comply with the provision of subsection 1073E6, limitation on residential curb cuts of this zoning ordinance. I apologize that I did not provide you with that actual section. So I did print it out for you, so you should have a copy of it so you can kind of have that to reference. But we do limit people to, so any new construction is only allowed to have one curb cut. People who have more than one curb cut or have those circular drives are allowed to keep it and, you know, repair, maintain it, but they're not allowed to expand it specifically if they don't meet the impervious surface requirements. So then they would have to come in for a variance. So in those, I was kind of trying to mimic that language in this, so to kind of make sure that circular driveways, the two curb cut stuff doesn't kind of slip under the radar screen with this allowance, that all of a sudden we're letting them widen their driveway because they're taking away something somewhere else.
Oh, okay. So that section B that you added is necessary for clarity.
Right, I was trying to clarify that. So the rule on the circular driveways would still stand regardless of, right, and the two curb cuts regardless of what you're doing elsewhere. Unless we really don't care, and then, you know, I can change the other one to reference this section, and, you know, you can finagle something somewhere else in order to be able to widen your circular driveway up a bit if you want to. I mean, if we don't really think it's a big, like, if we don't really care But I think since we're trying to minimize driveways in the front yard, and a circular driveway is obviously a lot of driveway in the front yard, we'd want to keep them from being able to widen that up, especially if they're already over their impervious surface.
I think 10% is satisfactory, actually. Because we're talking about the overall impervious on the lot is being decreased by 10%.
Well, are we talking
It's fair.
10% of the coverage, or are we talking reduction by 10 percentage points? So if we have, I'm trying to get some easy math this late in the day. Let's say cartoonish, because 90% coverage. So do we have to bring it down to 80, or do we have to bring it down to 81? So 10% of 90 is 9.
It's not 10. Right, it's not 10 percentage points, it would be 10% of
Which is
the
9.
total. Right.
It sounds like, yes, it's 10%
Versus 10
of what
percentage
exists.
Right.
Right.
And I sort of
Yeah,
share.
I wasn't thinking percentage points.
Yeah, and I'm thinking Adrian's concern is 10% enough? Because right now, we've had 2 instances where we've seen variances, but I think those were 2 very unique properties. In my understanding is that we haven't had impervious surface variance requests in a while. And I'm new to the board, but it's my understanding that there hasn't been many of these. So the concern I have is that if you have somebody who is playing with impervious surface, they're going to put in a basketball hoop, but take out, sort of a gazebo, and it evens out and they get the 10%, is that, have we thought through all the variations? And it sounds like we have some rationale for 10, but in generally we're just sort of picking that number out of the air. Why not 15? Why not 20? And it just seems the variation discussion has worked, and if you don't want to go in for a variation, you have to bring it down to 50. But in my mind, in most residential instances, if you're non-conforming, there's a lot that you can do to bring it down to 50 without necessarily, changing the nature of being able to comfortably operate on your property.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if 10 or 20 or 15 is the right answer, but it's just hard for me to arbitrarily pick that, and I'd rather rely on the variance structure that we have in place, just because of the unintended consequences that we can't possibly think through.
Which would require them to come in for a variance regardless.
Right.
If they don't want to bring it down to the 50%,
Right.
it would require them to.
Where they'd have to show hardship.
And to Commissioner Hannon's point, we've seen 2, we haven't seen 20, and that's because Director Apt has been able to work with people and get them down to 50%. If we recommend this to the board and the board accepts it, then people are going to take the easier way out and still have 55%, 60%, 70%, and not bring it down to 50%, which until now, they've been willing and able to do.
Agreed.
Mostly willing, but able to do.
Right. I mean, they might not be totally bringing it down, but they may be replacing, working within the footprint that they have, or even better yet, those that choose to remove areas or replace with permeable pavers, things like that. So,
I think this
Yeah.
will have the net effect of increasing impervious
Impervious.
surface in the village, which is contrary to sustainability.
So we're saying we're not going to have this. We've changed our minds.
I'm not saying that. The board has asked us to do, well,
I'll say
trustee
that.
Pollock.
I know,
well, I mean,
actually.
they're looking for your input on this.
Yeah,
So,
I would just as soon not encourage people to continue to have impervious, non-conforming impervious.
That makes sense, but we have some situations like the property on Gage where, they were kind of stuck. They had a lot of impervious surface. It wasn't their fault. There wasn't a lot they could do about it unless, and as I recall, we struggled with the variance standards with allowing them to do what they were doing? And do we think that we have, the variance standards are going to allow us, if a similar situation happens and we think they're making improvements to the property and the board thought it was an architecturally good proposal, do we have sufficient standards in the code to allow us to approve that kind of project again? Are we going to be in the same situation?
Well, in the instance of the impervious surface, I think the commission was unanimous in not seeing an issue with the impervious surface.
We granted.
I don't remember how we did that, though. What
We
was
also
our
didn't
basis for
explore
doing
many other options, because they had lots of hardscape, and
Yeah.
we
This is the
didn't
church?
address what was in the house on Gage.
The house on
And I got the
Gage.
gauge, perhaps, yeah.
It used to be a duplex. And again, I go back to, we don't have a lot of duplexes. And that was a unique building in that it had 2 driveways. It had,
2 garages.
it was never meant to be it was not intended to be a single-family house. Now it's trying to be turned into a single-family house. They were going to take out one of the driveways, which, made a lot of sense and helped. The nonconformity wasn't based on a single-family home where they just happen to have too much going on. There was a unique part of the story in my mind. The same thing when we talked about St. Mary's. There was a unique part of the story. They have a huge parking lot because they're a church. And the last thing we want to do is have a church that doesn't have adequate parking.
Which is most of them in town.
Everybody knows. So I think that it's the uniqueness that makes me comfortable with the variance process, where you have a single-family home that's always been a single-family home. It's non-conforming. They should consider pavers. I mean, there's a lot of alternatives that they can adopt that gets us to conformity, and non-impervious surface is a problem that we need to be very sensitive to. And I agree with the observation. If we adopt this, people will take the easy way out. What's my net effect? Do math, and I don't care about the 50% impervious surface requirement.
I'm fine with dropping this change. I'm okay. I just had some recollection that we struggled a little bit with the justification. But
I think
Yes.
we did struggle. Sorry, were you?
no, go. I was going to say.
But I think it was the combination of the stoop/porch and the impervious area. And I think to Commissioner Hannon's point, and I think you've convinced me that this is the way to go, because we haven't seen a lot of requests for impervious variations. If the owner is sufficiently creative, they do find solutions. And St. Mary's found a solution. And they were probably under the biggest, they had the hardest time in meeting it because they have so much impervious, but they did figure out a way to make their proposal work.
I mean, they didn't bring it into compliance, but they at least had a net zero.
But they made it net zero. And so even someone who had a hard time could make it net zero. So, and as Commissioner Hannon said, they're particularly unique with a massive amount of impervious. Most places don't have that much blacktop.
Correct.
Or concrete or roof or whatever. So I would also support not even going down this path.
Okay.
So we're not going to facilitate non-compliance.
Imagine that.
Let's go backwards. What about decks?
So, I guess the concern was that the stoop regulations were perhaps either too restrictive or too nebulous, or as interpreted by staff, because, we just say a stoop is allowed to encroach no more than 4 feet. We define a stoop as just an entryway, access into the building. So as staff has interpreted it, staff has not interpreted that something that is 13 or 16 feet wide is a stoop. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what staff would say is an entry platform into the house to provide access. So, but that's not, there's no specific size written into the code. You know, there's just that maximum projection with that caveat that unless the building code requires something a little bit more. So it defers to the building code in instances for stairs and stoops. So, you know, at the February meeting, you know, Commissioner Miller had brought up just having kind of a standard, you can get this much entryway, this big, it's only allowed to encroach so much, or, you know, kind of having just, whether it's a stoop or a porch or, you know, like kind of however it ends up being, do we just kind of give that? And I thought it was kind of interesting that we had a couple of communities that sort of did that. You had, what was it, Clarendon Hills, that says, you know, permanent non-enclosed entryway covers. So that gets into that roof, awning, canopy, cover kind of thing over an entryway. They're allowed to project 6 feet into the required front yard. And they have a width restriction. So you kind of get a little bit of that, any entry kind of idea to it. You get a maximum projection of 6 feet, and they can't exceed 12 feet in width. And what was another one that I thought was... You know, a lot of the porch, the restrictions seem to kind of mimic porch restrictions. So you have that 6 foot, 11 foot kind of thing. And I think of some of like the 4 squares and stuff like that that have those front porches that don't have a roof. You know, they're the entire width of the house. They're this raised concrete platform with the railing around them, but they don't have a roof over them. You know, they're just kind of this uncovered, you know, deck, porch, whatever, you know, you want to call it. And, you know, obviously it's more than a stoop because it's, you know, the entire width of the house, and it's got like knee wall, you know, typically like a knee wall around it and stuff. And what does that kind of qualify as? It's not porch because it doesn't have the roof over it per our definition. It's more than a stoop, or at least that I would consider a stoop. It's, you know, it's a raised front patio. You know, it's a kind of this weird thing. But I mean, there's houses in town that have those. There's not necessarily a lot of them, but there are houses in town that do have those. And what do we, you know, if somebody wanted to, you know, say that's something that the house on Scottswood that ended up doing the enclosed front porch. What if that's something that they wanted to do? Rather than the enclosed front porch, what if they wanted to put this on there? And that's you know, it's a more 4 square prairie style to it. This is something that you would see on the front of it. How, you know, again, you have the variance process. You can go through the variance process to allow whatever that structure would be to encroach into that street yard. But just, you know, some things to kind of think about. You know, there was another house on Fairbank, and that's kind of where we got into the whole stoop thing when I started. She had a little stoop, and it needed to be repaired. So it got taken off, and they discovered a lot of rot and stuff that was behind the concrete stoop. So she wanted to do something different, and so she wanted to do a wood deck, basically, in the front. But, you know, she wanted to call it a stoop. She wanted, you know, or is it a porch? I was like, well, we don't allow porches to encroach into the street yard, so I can't do that. But we can call it a stoop. You know, but if it's a stoop, then you can't have it the whole width of your house. You know, you have to bring it in. So, you know, we ended up compromising on something that was probably about 6 feet wide and came out about 4 feet per the code. It came out, you know, encroached 4 feet into the street yard to allow her to have that entry into the house and be able to kind of maintain the foundation and whatever weirdness was happening there, properly flash it and stuff, and not need to worry about the infiltration that was happening with the concrete stoop right at the front, so.
I think one of the issues is the depth of the allowed encroachment. Because this is not an issue unless it's only an issue when you're encroaching into the street yard. So how deep should these things be allowed, and how much of the street yard should remain? And when they did the new front porch regulations, when you guys did that, there was, I think, a 20-foot
20-foot setback.
hard line that had to be. If you can't maintain that, you can't get a porch. And maybe we should do a similar thing with the front entryway if we're looking to write something about that.
So, I mean, I think we have it written that we do allow the eaves now to encroach into the street yard by 24 inches. So
Right.
we, gave a little bit of flexibility with the covers and stuff in that way. We do allow awnings, canopies to encroach. I think it's 24 inches.
I think it's 36 inches.
So
'cause I have a
36
note here.
inches.
And I think, I also made a note that the new unenclosed porch regulations allow 36-inch
Yes.
eaves, but house eaves can only be
Eave.
24 inches, which I thought was interesting.
So, yeah, that was a little bit of a discussion. I think the commission kind of felt like the house's eaves, they weren't necessarily comfortable with it going quite as much, but with the porches, depending on the style that you're trying to do, you might need a deeper eave, depending on the pitch and style that you're trying to do. So, a little bit more on that than with the house. 36 inches, okay. So, I mean, 36 inches for awnings and canopies into the required yard. The code allows a stoop to encroach no more than 4 feet into that required street yard. And then the steps are allowed to encroach. It says stoops and steps. They're allowed to encroach 4 feet or whatever is required to meet the building code requirement. So, I think what is a little bit nebulous then gets to be into, do we want to kind of define the width of that stoop area? Do we want to limit the width of whatever covering might be over that stoop area, so that it's not, going across the entire width of the house? Do we care? Then it's a porch, and then they got to follow the porch regulations. But if it's this narrower amount, then maybe that's helps make that differentiation between porch and stoop. So I think that the issue, the overall issue with the gauge one was that it already encroached into its street yard because it had this enclosed front porch that kind of became part of the house. And so it was already encroaching 8 feet. So really anything they did onto the front of it was going to need a variance because there was already an 8-foot encroachment. So whether it was eaves or a cover or, the stoop, just about anything was going to cause an issue. There was a little bit of leeway in the, whatever it takes to meet the code requirements. So maybe if they'd done just a little concrete pad in the front and brought it down, we would have been able to work with that. But, it was a very narrow window of what they might have been able to do without having to come before you. I think really the main option was to pick one of the side doors and just have the stoop there and the stairs coming down. It was the only way they could have avoided having to come before you to do something with a new entry for that, kind of revising that entry for that porch. So that was really somewhat a unique circumstance in that case. Not that it couldn't have been accommodated without a variance, but it kind of had its own, at least in my mind, but ultimately that one was approved. So,
So I'm in favor of, as I said 2 meetings ago, allowing some kind of a front entryway as long as it's fairly limited in size, but not tiny like a stoop, something that's as an allowance. But as I think about it more, at least having some minimum maintained street yard after that is put on. So with some of our houses, that might not be possible still without a variance. But I think it's an asset. It could be an asset to a lot of houses to not just be allowing a stoop and steps.
So, I mean, in those instances, you would be allowed to have a stoop that encroaches the 4 feet, regardless of what that ultimate setback is. The way it's written now, if you did only have a 12-foot setback, you could have, a
Right.
4-foot deep stoop that comes out and the stairs to come down to meet it. Obviously, I wouldn't let your stairs come on public property, but so you'd have to kind of figure out, maybe the stairs have to go to the side or something, depending on what the height is, but you would be allowed to have that. If we get beyond kind of the width of the door, too much past the width of the door, then we're a little bit beyond stoop territory.
Right.
And
I think in general, it seems like a stoop and steps is considered basically simply an access platform by the official building code or whatever. So to consider it something much grander than that would be inconsistent. So I think we should make the necessary changes to make that clear. That a stoop and steps isn't, 15 feet wide by 5 feet deep. That's not a stoop and steps.
so are we still comfortable with that 4-foot encroachment? And then maybe we put some sort of width restriction on it? I think your standard door is 3 feet wide.
Maybe if we just went, like we do with the garage, 6 inches on either side of the door, so that if,
I have one of those. It's awful.
Yeah, I think you need more
Yeah,
width.
I've kind of been doing that 6-foot width has
Do
kind of
we-
been my limit.
6 foot total.
6 foot overall width has kind of been my limit on stoops.
But then if we want to do 6 foot wide and if we're allowing 4 feet, do we want to give people leeway that they can go up to sort of 25 square feet and then they can arrange it however they want and use that space? You know what I mean? That dimension, or 30 square, or whatever, so that it's not just 6 by 4, 6 by 4, 6 by 4.
but it's still 4 foot maximum?
Yes.
Well, that's the
yes,
encroachment,
right.
and I mean,
Yes,
somebody's
okay.
door may be set back a little bit, and so they might not even need to encroach 4 feet,
I like the square footage approach because each house is different. You don't want a cookie cutter 4x6s.
With the minimum depth required of 3 feet.
What if you have double French doors?
Don't do that.
But maybe you already do.
Well, if each door is 36 inches wide, then that gets us to 6 feet wide. So
Yeah.
6 feet times the 4 foot is the 24 feet. So I think actually the 25 square foot maximum does give flexibility, and if you want it narrower or wider to fit your unique entryway.
but keep the 4-foot encroachment restriction.
I think so.
Yes.
Yes. Otherwise, we're getting into porch territory.
Dreaded porch territory.
And then along with it, do we need to say something about any steps that lead up to it, that they can only be the same or narrower dimension, or not? I mean, what if someone had a, 7 foot wide steps leading up in some grand fashion? I mean, or do we just consider that impervious surface and we don't care?
I mean, it is impervious surface, and it gets counted towards impervious surface, so,
But it does visually impact that front
yeah.
of the house. So do you want to say anything about steps?
No, and the reason being is steps end up being, I'm not thinking of the right words, but the dimensions of steps and the number of steps you need are very dependent on the height of said entryway. So
And the
I
building
think,
about the
code will
width.
define that a little bit.
I'm
I
sorry.
thought Commissioner Miller was referring to the width of the stairs. Can they be the
I
whole
think
6 feet?
you are,
or-
but I'm not sure people will get that creative.
Right, okay.
Because you still have to
Right.
have some kind of handrails to keep from falling over the sides, so that tends to bring those steps in very quickly.
Yeah, okay.
But if we put an awning or a canopy on it, it becomes a porch.
If we put a roof over it,
Well, an awning is a roof-like shelter, and a canopy is a roof-like shelter, according to our current definitions. And unless we strike roof-like,
Well, is there anything wrong with calling it something like a front entry, which can have a covering of a certain dimension? I don't know. I mean, do we have to stop it from being called a porch?
I mean, we don't have any restrictions on awnings on width. There were some communities that did restrict awnings and canopies to a certain percentage or a maximum width. Some of them were, was it 3 feet on either side of an entryway? So, I mean, if we want to get into that, we can maybe restrict the awning canopy
To be the size of the stoop?
to, you know,
That's
or
where
approximately the
actually I
size
was
of the
gonna go. Is the awning can be no
wider than.
it can cover no more than, it can have a footprint of no more than 25 square feet as well.
Something that small, you'd be hard pressed to call that a porch.
I agree.
Yeah, you couldn't put anything.
but some of these pictures that you gave us are just so wonderful, because you give this to an average person, they're going to say, that's a stoop, that's a stoop. But by our current definition, they're porches because they have a roof.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the problem we had with the Gage property. And the board also had the same problem, and I don't know that we are fixing it yet.
So,
And I don't know what the "it" is exactly.
Well, if we're saying that a stoop can be covered, are we not fixing it?
I mean, we allow awnings. We
Yeah,
allow,
awnings
you know,
or
we allow
canopies.
awnings to encroach into the street yard by 36 inches.
Well, but some of these have, most of the pictures in your sampling have roofs.
Some sort of
You mean the roof
type,
extensions?
It's a roof
Yes.
some sort of
Yeah.
roof type structure.
I would
Yes.
say.
You know, less awning-like, more roof-like. Little, you know, like little
But then again-
portable, you know, portico, you know.
I don't know how many
Portico
of
things.
those were encroaching. I don't know. I mean,
Right, I mean, there's,
I don't remember. So that would be fine, right? As long as they're not encroaching.
again, we allow eaves to encroach 24 inches, so say it's a little roof-like eave thing. You get 24 inches.
And maybe our maximum square footage takes care of it.
I think so. Except I can't quite put my finger on it. I think it does, because we were struggling with the fact that on Gage it was extra wide.
Right.
But if the width is restricted to the same footprint as the stoop, they kind of go, they do go hand in hand, and we've given them a maximum footprint.
Right, and 36 inches is the minimum depth for,
Required.
you know, for the required landing. So at least that 36-inch area, if it came out 36 inches as they're allowed to per code, I mean, maybe we adjust it to awning canopy or architectural roof-like detail, or, you know, I'm sure I can come up with something to call the little things they put over. You know, entryway cover / architectural features, you know, and say that those are allowed to encroach 36 inches as well. And then you at least have that, it projects out the 3 feet and provides that cover for at least that immediate entry area. I mean, maybe it doesn't cover the entire stoop, but at least it,
So you're proposing they can have any kind of cover, canopy, awning.
Or some
Roof
sort of
extension.
small roof-like architectural feature that, you know, they put on houses to kind of define the front,
Right.
you know. I mean, typically they are only like maybe 24 or 36 inches. I mean, they're not usually substantial.
I like that.
That seem?
Good luck with the wording.
And keep it to the 36 inches for that? Like it said, just kind of add it to the awnings and canopies and the permitted encroachments and give it the 36 inches that's allowed to come out in the
Yes.
street yard? Kind of keep it all even?
Yes.
Okay. And 25 square foot max was what we liked for the entryway landing. Stoop.
I thought it was 24.
Well,
Maybe we round it up to 25 to
Should
give
be
them a little bit of
25.
Yeah,
flexibility.
25.
It's a Wednesday, why not?
a nice quarter.
It gives design flexibility.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And then did we want to have some kind of minimum street yard then, or not? Like, again, that wouldn't maybe have worked in the gauge situation, but, you know, you can't do this up to the public sidewalk. You have to have at least so much space between whatever it is as the front line and the, you know, 10 feet, 15 feet.
My only concern would be structures that don't have it, but need to have a stoop.
Right, and again, then they
That's
come in for
about-
variance, so that's that tension there.
So I mean, I think the code was written to give that flexibility that you get the 4 feet or whatever you need to meet the code to provide that proper entry and get to the grade. So I think putting a hard setback line on that, I mean, I think the 25 square feet kind of keeps things in check, and then you just kind of have, I mean, I'm not going to let you put stairs on public property, so if you don't have the distance to get there by the front property line, you're going to have to hitch it to the left or the right then.
All right, I guess we can see how it goes.
All right, I will see what I can cobble together on that. And then do we want to do anything with the definitions for awnings and canopies?
There seem to be trends in other communities, temporary versus permanent, non-rigid versus rigid, and whether they have explicit language about supports.
So, I mean, I think we can definitely make sure that the zoning code definition better matches the sign code definition that we incorporated into the sign code recently. So with those independent kind of canopies can get covered in that. So it's supported from the ground, deck, or floor, kind of mimic that language a little bit more.
Yes.
I personally don't see a need for temporary versus permanent or rigid versus non-rigid, but
It doesn't do anything for us.
Yeah, I really think like the big difference between an awning or a canopy is whether it's supported by the ground or not. I mean, you have some, what I would call a canopy, but aren't really canopies, or when you have those kind of like metal awnings that come out over like entryways that you like see at hotels and some of like the more modern office buildings and stuff, where they have those metal ones that project out and then have the back bracing, you know, so it's just maybe the 6 inch, you know, it's maybe 6 inches, you know, tall, that kind of metal covering over the entry or the windows. They seem more like a canopy, but they're not supported by the ground. So, I mean, they're an awning, they're just not a fabric awning, they're a metal awning, you know, a metal awning. They just don't have that face of an awning like you would think of with a canvas awning, because it's just the edge that you're really seeing, because it's flat and just, you know, 90-degree angle sticks out, and then it just has those supporting structures that come out and hold up the front and pin back into the building.
So are you suggesting that a residence would have a canopy braced above the canopy, or not?
No, I'm just saying, you know, those are, you know, you might see an, you know, especially if you get maybe a more modern house that's being built or a more modern commercial development that's happening, you know, those are the kind of awnings that you see kind of happening in those instances, as opposed to the classic kind of cloth canvas awning. You get that metal, flat metal that comes out and just has the small bit of edging, as opposed to that kind of full face that kind of comes out on that angle out from the building. So.
I know I should know the answer to this, but do we regulate them differently, awning and canopy?
Not too much, no.
So it doesn't really matter
I
necessarily.
think the only thing we get into is possibly for the business districts. We might need to finesse that a little bit, especially for a freestanding one.
So the definition of, our definition of unenclosed porch only refers to, may include columns for the purpose of supporting the roof. So that's always assuming there's going to be a roof and not a canopy or an awning. So I think maybe with what we're proposing now, we may want to somehow specify what that covering is going to be, awning, canopy, or roof, or whatever. I mean, just so it's very clear, so people aren't trying to torture the definition of a canopy or an awning. Is this what this is that this architect has proposed? I don't think it really matters to me what it is, what we call it.
And now that we've solved kind of what a stoop is,
We hope.
in the gauge situation, we got hung up on whatever the roof-like structure we were talking about was supported by from the ground, as opposed to just hanging out. And do we want to go down that path as well to allow this coverage over the stoop to have support from the ground as well? Because right now, as I read it, you can't. That would cause it to morph into a porch, notwithstanding.
Well, canopies are supported by the ground, and we allow
Okay.
canopies to encroach 36 inches. I think the idea is, though, is that a canopy is different than a roof. You know, it's a different kind of architectural thing than a roof. So,
Okay, so we already provided the canopies are supported.
yeah, and
Okay.
those are, you know, canopies are defined as something that's supported from the ground, and they're allowed to encroach 36 inches
Okay.
into a required yard.
What is this?
That is not an awning. That's more of that like architectural roof like.
Or the
Thing that I'm
the other
talking
side,
about.
the picture on the other side,
Oh, that's a tough one.
that's also, it's just like some kind of a
I thought that
architectural
one was an
piece.
eave.
This?
That looked like an eave, yeah.
That's an extended eave there, yeah.
Like I said,
But there
11
isn't
story.
anything, it's like a mansard roof, so it doesn't have eaves. The rest of the roof looks like it doesn't have eaves, it just has gutter.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a roof extension or something.
It's a roof
To me,
extension.
it doesn't make any difference.
But that will be allowed on a stoop. You said.
That would be allowed.
Up to
Going forward.
36 inches
Up to
into
36
the
inches.
required.
Right.
we covered everything then?
Any issues with decks definition?
Yeah, I'm trying, Stoops doesn't, they're typically a masonry, but they're not, they don't have to be made of masonry, so you can't have a wood stoop entryway. But if you want to have a deck, like you think of a deck, those are only permitted in the rear yard, so.
So on this one, come back with language before we have a public hearing, so we can hash it.
Kind of,
Yes, please.
you can see what you think of how Michael and I come up with the entryway, architectural feature, roof extension, canopy, encroachment.
We really fix Stoops. Okay. No new business?
No, I am preparing the public notice for the rezoning, so that should be on the May agenda for a public hearing, and that's for that property on Ogden Avenue. So that's going to be sent out to the paper, so that'll be in the paper next week for the May agenda. So we do have an item on the agenda that's a public hearing for the May agenda, and then I will have some draft language for Stoops awnings then for you to look at then as well, and I'll be able to give you an update kind of on how things are going with the village board discussion on our attached garages and driveways discussion, and we'll be moving towards the public hearing then on that in June and Preservation Commission review in June. So we'll at least have a status update on that for the May meeting.
First zoning amendment, exciting. Okay, motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So moved. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.